When we first start learning Chinese, each new character is hard to learn, but as we learn more, it gets easier. But a new problem soon appears: mixing up similar characters. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about an annoying problem when learning to write Chinese characters, namely mixing up similar characters. To be able to read and write Chinese, you need to learn several thousand characters, and for a beginner this seems very daunting because the first characters are hard to learn and remember, and so doing this thousands of times seems almost impossible. However, the longer you learn Chinese and the more characters you learn, the more you realize that the real challenge when learning Chinese characters isn't learning new characters as such, but rather to keep them apart from characters you've already learned. So while the difficulty of learning new characters decreases, the risk of confusing or mixing up characters increases. While spaced repetition software and flashcard apps are fairly good at helping you learn and remember how to write Chinese characters, these types of programs are not very good at dealing with the issue at hand. This is because the problem is not related to one flashcard specifically, but rather several of them and the relationship between them. So as a beginner, you might put a character like Wo, meaning I or me, on a flashcard, and then use that flashcard to remember how to write the character. The problem you are trying to solve is how to remember to write this thing in the first place. However, the problem we're talking about here is not just that you can't write the character, is that you write something you think is right, but then turns out to be the wrong character. This can also happen without you noticing, so there can be 2 or 3 characters that you keep mixing up, but you never see them at the same time or close enough that you realize that you are mixing them up. And so you have 3 leeches, or flashcards that drain a lot of time and energy, that just keep resurfacing, and just hammering away at your flashcard app won't really help here. So you need a different approach. And just like when killing leeches or dealing with flashcards you keep getting wrong over and over, the most important point is that you take decisive action. Like I said, if you try to rely on brute force to solve this type of problem, you will just be frustrated and waste a lot of time. The strategy I want to recommend here is essentially to trace your errors to the source. This involves investigating why you got something wrong, rather than just hitting again and hoping that keeping going the same way you have will solve the problem. The problem here is that it's hard to notice these problems, because you rarely see the characters you mix up next to each other, and they might be weeks or months away from each other in your flashcard queue. This means that you can learn, forget, and then relearn these characters many times without realizing that there is a problem. The method I describe here is not something you should use every time you forget how to write a character, but if you feel that there is a risk that you might be mixing 2 characters up, this method works really well. As mentioned, it can sometimes be hard to know though, so randomly tracing some errors occasionally just to see where the trace leads can be quite interesting. So the first step is to note the correct character, or what you should have written but failed to recall. For example, maybe the character you were supposed to write is mo, meaning to stroke or to touch. If you want to see the characters I'm talking about, you can check the written article on Hacking Chinese, but I'll do my best to make this possible to follow in audio only. To do this, you need to write on paper or use an app that doesn't help you too much. For example, if you use Skritter to use Chinese characters, the default setting is that the app will help you by snapping characters to a model. And if you do this, you will probably realize that you're writing something wrong before you've finished writing the character. So it's hard to say what you would have written without that support. There is a setting in Skritter called rawest squigs, which gets rid of this and essentially allows you to write as if on paper. You don't need to use Skritter, but you do need to use an app which allows you to finish writing the character before you compare, because otherwise, like I said, you can't really know what you would have written without help. So if we continue with the example from before, you tried to write mo but got it wrong, and maybe you wrote mu instead, meaning model, pattern, or to copy. This character is identical on the right side but has a different component on the left, and there's a tree component instead of a hand component. Now, step 3 is to look up the character you wrote instead, so the incorrect character that you wrote. And the easiest way to do this is to use handwriting input in Pleco or Hanping, which will allow you to write anything you want, and it will suggest the closest character. You will then find this character mu or mo, which isn't the one you try to write. If you've been learning Chinese for some time, you will then sigh and say, oh, how stupid I am. Why can't I keep these characters separate? This is obvious now that I look at it. Step 4 is to save this information somewhere so you can deal with it when you have more time and energy and when you sit in front of a computer or have access to the resources that you want. The 3 previous steps can be done while you are reviewing. You just take a short break from your flashcard session. But this step where you go and research these characters and try to create mnemonics, etc., that we're going to talk about next, is easier to do in a focused session. Like I said, you should take decisive action. When you look at the character you incorrectly wrote, there are a few different things that can happen, and depending on what happens, you will also take different actions. So first, the character might be very rare or not exist. This means that you are not actually mixing up characters, you just forgot how to write this one and you guessed wrong. It's worth noting that there are so many variant characters though, so just because you find a character that happens to look like the one you wrote, this doesn't mean that you are confusing characters. It could be that the character you looked up is extremely rare, or it's just a character you haven't learned yet. And then my suggestion is to not learn this character. Just ignore it and treat it as beyond scope for now. This is not a problem of mixing something up, but if you start learning characters just because they look like other characters you've learned, you are going to start mixing them up in the future if you didn't already. There's plenty of evidence from vocabulary acquisition research that if you learn things that are similar at the same time, you risk mixing them up later. So essentially, if you find one or several characters that look similar to what you try to write or the character you actually wrote, this is not a good time to learn these, just ignore them. So the second case is that the character exists and it is used in modern Chinese, but you haven't learned it yet. As mentioned, this is functionally the same as the character not existing or being extremely rare. If you haven't learned it yet, don't learn it now. Third, the character exists and overlaps with the character you try to write. This means that even though you're wrong, you're also at least partly right. So, for example, if you write 工作 to work with the wrong 做, maybe you use the 做 in 作业 instead of the correct one. You're kind of right, they do have overlapping meanings, and it's not a strange mistake to have made. This is not so much about plainly mixing up completely different characters, such as being confused by near synonyms, which I think is partly a different issue, and I will put links to articles where I discuss this in the show notes to this episode. The fourth case is that you have learned both characters and they don't overlap. And this is essentially the example I brought up earlier with må to touch versus mo or moi, model or to copy. Both these characters exist and they are in common usage, so you need to remember which is which. As mentioned earlier, the first step to solving this type of issue is to realize that there is an issue, and simply seeing these two characters next to each other might actually resolve the problem for you. If it doesn't, the steps you should take are similar to when killing leeches, as I also mentioned earlier, which is something we discussed in detail in episode 280, and as usual I will put links in the show notes as well. So here are some things you can try, and these are not in chronological order and you don't have to do all of them, so it's more like a toolkit you can bring out when you encounter these problems. So first, you should analyze the composition of the characters. Which are the components? Which functions do they have in the characters? And maybe you know this already, but check it again to make sure you got it right. If you misunderstood something when you learned these characters in the first place, maybe that's the solution to your problem. Second, you can try to put the character in context. So instead of trying to figure out the difference between the two 做, for example, as single characters, you can study them in relevant contexts. If you know a bunch of words containing these different characters, draw a little mind map to see which words belong with which character. If your flashcard app allows it, you can also append this information to the back of the card. Third, highlight the difference between the characters. This ought to be pretty obvious because the whole point here is to try to keep the characters distinct, and then focusing on the unique points or unique features of each character makes sense. This is probably one of the best usages of mnemonics and memory techniques. You need to remember something specific, and you might not be called upon to recall this information anytime soon, and when you do, taking some time before you come up with the correct answer is usually not a problem. How to use mnemonics to make Chinese characters easier to learn goes beyond the scope of this article, but it's something I have discussed in many articles and podcast episodes before, so please check the links in the show notes. What I will say though is that the mnemonic should focus on the key difference between the characters you keep mixing up. A good example of this might be the two character components that are identical save for a small dot, namely liang, meaning good, or gun, which is not used as a standalone character, but the original meaning is to look back. The problem here is that there are many characters that use these components, and the only difference is a dot. And remembering something as meaningless as a dot can be very hard. This dot, however, is quite significant because these two components usually appear as sound components, and they have very different sounds attached to them, and usually you know which character is which just by pronunciation. So the first one, liang, which has the dot, is included in characters that end in yang or ang, such as lang, wave, or niang, mother or young woman. The other one, gun, without the dot, is included in characters that end in en or in, so for example hen in 我很好, or yin as in yinhang, bank. If this is the first thing you hear about phonetic components, I realize that this discussion is not enough to explain the phenomenon, but I will put links in the show notes. The point I wanted to make here is that when you focus on mnemonics for these characters you keep mixing up, make sure you try to find something that is there, like the difference between having the dot and not having the dot here gives you a very good clue already, because these are different components with different pronunciations, and that happens to unlock many of these confusions here. Naturally, the problem of a dot or not a dot in these cases has a very neat and satisfactory resolution, but this is often not the case. And if there isn't already a solution, or you don't find one by looking, you can just make something up. The point here is that you should focus the mnemonic on the key differences between the characters you keep mixing up. In essence, what I'm saying is that remembering small arbitrary difference between things is very hard, so you need to make these things less arbitrary and more concrete. And if you can use something that is actually there in the writing system already, that's great, but if you can't find anything or there isn't anything, feel free to make something up. It's time to wrap up this episode, and my goal here was to give you some tools you can use to deal with characters that you keep mixing up, or just to highlight the problem and the idea that you need to pay attention to these, so you indeed realize that there might be characters that you are mixing up. So the key strategy here is to trace your errors to their source. Don't just note that you got something wrong and be frustrated about it, try to figure out why you got it wrong. Sometimes this leads nowhere, but sometimes you might be able to solve these issues simply by knowing about them. If you want more hands-on advice and practical examples, I wrote an article a while back called 7 Mistakes I Made When Writing Chinese Characters and What I Learned From Them. In that article, I trace 7 errors to their sources, and I deal with the characters decisively. While not specifically about mixing characters up, some of the cases are about mix-ups, and the general principles apply no matter what. I hope you found this episode helpful, and if you have some pairs or triplets of characters you keep mixing up, feel free to head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. And maybe that's the first step to stop mixing those characters up. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.